So, members of the jury, Zachary Wright Adams is innocent of the 8 charges that he is facing here today. And it's worth saying it one more time. Zachary Wright Adams is innocent of all these charges. So, how is it that we got here today? As a matter of fact, not only did Zachary Wright Adams, he did not murder Holly Lynn Bobo, he did not kidnap Holly Lynn Bobo, he did not abduct Holly Lynn Bobo, he did not rape Holly. He did not, as a matter of fact, know Holly Bobo and had never even laid eyes on her. The district attorney has already spoken about the fact that Holly Bobo was a good person. And this is a case that has certainly captured everybody's attention because from all appearances, Holly Bobo was the all-American girl. She was a good student. She was a good daughter. She had a boyfriend that she loved. She was working very hard to be a nurse. She was a quiet, shy girl. She was kind to others. She loved her family, her country, and the Lord. And she was a good person. And we all like to think that if we're good people and we don't put ourselves in a bad situation, then nothing bad will happen to ourselves or our families. And this happens to be one of those tragedies in which somebody who was a good person, something bad happened to that person. However, Zach Adams is not the person who's guilty of this crime. And in the beginning, and perhaps also what has really captured everybody's attention about this crime is the fact that it was caught so early. And you'll hear testimony, the proof is going to come in, that you'll hear testimony that basically the police were called within minutes of Holly's brother and the neighbor the neighbor heard her scream. Holly's brother was outside or looking around. He had looked through the window, had seen something happening, and basically the police are called within minutes. The police are at the house within probably about 15 minutes, perhaps 20 minutes of the scream first being heard and Holly's last text that she sent out. And from that point on, however, they just were not able, even though the police reacted so quickly, through a series of events, they were not able to find her that morning. And so after that very first initial few hours when they were looking for her, what happened is law enforcement and the TBI came in very quickly on this. They basically have interviewed every person in Decatur County, many of these people twice, but they have gone through, it's almost just like trying to drink from a fire hydrant, all the information they got. They opened up a TBI hotline and people called in. I mean, they had thousands and thousands of telephone calls from across the country, from international calls where people were calling in with tips with a possible sightings here. They had numerous psychics that called in, people who had dreams about where she was, people who had their own theories about where she was, and law enforcement was working very, very hard to try to find Holly, one, hoping against hope that they could return her to the family, but they're also trying to solve the mystery of what has happened to Holly that morning, the morning of April the 13th, 2011. And so from there, they began to interview everybody. For years, they worked to solve the crime, and I think that the government touched on the fact that they had interviewed and talked to and investigated this person, Terry Britt. But that is not where the case started. So first of all, there's the next door neighbor, James Barnes, who heard a scream that morning. He heard somebody screaming from the direction of the Bobo house. And James Barnes, and he lived on the next door neighbor's property with his mother, Kathy Wise. And the first that the state really looked into was James Barnes. They investigated him. They searched his whole house. They spent months and months swarming over them and making the Barnes family the big suspect in their investigation. They got their phone records. They just investigated them completely. And also, in the days before Holly had disappeared, James Barnes had a friend over. His name was Keith Clark. Keith Clark had been at the house. The state investigated Keith Clark with a vigorous fury. They got his phone records. They checked into everything about him. Then the next person that the state turned an eye against was John Dodd. John Dodd was a grandson of some people that lived down the road from where Holly lived. Somebody that morning said that they had spotted him in his white pickup truck right there in the area, and he had a four-wheeler also in the area, and there was some talk that maybe the person that took Holly had gone through the woods on a four-wheeler with her, and so they turned to all their investigative powers on James Dodd, and they absolutely tore his life up. It was hard on him because he suddenly became the suspect that everybody was looking at as the one who had taken Holly Bobo. And in a community that small, and everybody so very, very interested in what had happened to Holly, and people were genuinely very concerned about what had happened to Holly, that then rumors and just what was going on just spread like wildfire. So as soon as one person is rumored to have been involved, it was terrible. But the law enforcement investigations did all kinds of affidavits to get things on John Dodd. They searched his computers, they searched his telephone, they looked at his Facebook page, they were looking at his car, they investigated all of his property. As a matter of fact, they even had dogs that hid on his property and had allegedly traced Holly Bobo's scent to his driveway, or his grandparents' driveway. So he was thoroughly investigated at some point. Then there was another person who was investigated thoroughly, Blake Barnett. And they turned all their attention to Blake Barnett. And at one point, we're putting a lot of energy into him. Next, they looked at Terry and Janet Britt. The state of Tennessee looked at Terry and Janet Britt. They really investigated them. They got subpoenas. They searched their house. They did wiretaps on them. They looked at them very closely. However, through the wiretaps and through the subpoenas, and they even put listening devices in their house, they lived in a trailer, they had a metal roof, they were never able to get any type of, quote, confession from them. What they were wanting was some type of confession, some type of discussion between the couple where they were acknowledging, perhaps, that they had done this. They weren't able to get that, even though they did get a lot of circumstantial evidence in that case. Then law enforcement turned to Jerry Evans. Jerry Evans was a man that lived down the road near Five Forks, just down the road from Holly's house. And they turned to this man, Jerry Evans. They did thorough search on his house. They did all kinds of affidavits on him to get all kinds of information. They looked at him. There's another man who may or may not come to testify in this case, named Michael Alexander. At one point, they were very suspicious that Michael Alexander was involved in it. There's another man that they investigated, Jason Nichols. And the morning that Holly disappeared, and the case has been an absolute fire hydrant of information coming in. But one of the things they did is they got all the cell phone records from all the cell phone towers where Holly Bobo's cell phone pinged that morning. They got all the records of everybody else's phone who pinged at the same time her phone did. Jason Nichols came up as a person who was a registered sex offender. His phone pinged that morning, and his wife's phone also pinged that morning on two different towers where Holly's phone was. They investigated Jason Nichols. As a matter of fact, he had a potential possible kidnapping of another woman 1 week to the day earlier. And he'd also had he had accosted several women at the Hickory Mall, the old Hickory Mall in Jackson, Tennessee. So they they turned their focus on Jason Nichol at some point. And then, of course, one of the more tragic things that the state did is they turned their investigation on Clint Bobo. At some point, the Bobos retained an attorney to represent Clint because the state of Tennessee was absolutely determined to show that Clint Bobo was somehow involved in this case. And they got all kinds of records on the Bobo. They got phone records. They oftentimes treated the Bobo family as though they were involved, limiting any kind of information that they shared with the Bobo family because they were treating them as though they were suspects in this case. And so all of that came up, and yet at the end of the Clint Bobo they really focused on at the end of 2012, all of this is transpired, and now as they're heading into 2013, and they're in the fall of 2013, headed into 2014, it's been 2.5, almost 3 years, and they still do not have a suspect that they can firmly go after. They don't have anybody that they've narrowed it down at this point as to who it is that has committed this crime. And at this point, and as it's been said many times by the TBI, this was the most expensive and most exhaustive investigation in the history of the state of Tennessee. And yet, when they came to 2013, they had nothing. They had a great big goose egg. They paid all this money, and they had absolutely nothing to show for it. And the citizens of Decatur County, the family of Holly Bobo, and the public at large all wanted answers to how such a crime could happen, how the police could be involved right away, and still, after all the resources and all the information they had, they could have absolutely nobody charged by that point. And it's also important to keep in mind that in the beginning of 2014 is an election year. Who's coming up for re-election in 2014? The district attorney. The district attorney who is in office, who'd been in office for a while, Hansel McAdams. He is coming up for re-election. Who else is coming up for re-election? The sheriff of Decatur County Sheriff. Because at that time, actually, all the judges, all the district attorneys, and all the law enforcement is all coming up for re-election. So there's some additional pressure at that point. And Matt Stowe has just announced that he will be running against Hansel McAdams for District Attorney General of the 24th Judicial District. So what happens at this point? And the Bobo family had been estranged at some point at this time from the TBI. So the Bobos reached out to a person that they knew, a man named Dennis Benjamin, who went to their family church. And he was a retired police officer through Memphis. He was a retired Memphis police officer. So the Bobos reached out to him. And many people had been volunteering to try to help the Bobos also. But this Dennis Benjamin came forward and was wanting to try to help the family. So Mr. Benjamin went around and made some inquiries as to what was going on. And definitely one of the people's names who had come up, or several people's names had come up in the investigation, and it was Jason Autry, Zach Adams, Shane Austin. Their names had come up because, as I said, there were lots and lots of people's names who had come up during the investigation. But one of the people, and there's a man named Victor Dinsmore, and one of the things that Victor Dinsmore specifically told, because Victor Dinsmore has a past rape conviction. And so Victor Dinsmore was one of the people that the police had looked at and lived close to where the body was, where they eventually found Holly Bobo's body. But Victor Dinsmore lived over there. Victor Dinsmore lived on Yellow Springs Road, and on the east side of his home and on the west side of his home, they found some of Holly Bobo's personal property thrown out on the road. And Victor Dinsmore tells Dennis Benjamin, well, I think that maybe Zach Adams did it. Victor Dinsmore had heard that Zach Adams was trying to use Victor Dinsmore as a alibi for that day, and Victor was disturbed at that point. I think he was erroneously told that Zach Adams had used him as an alibi, but one of the law enforcement had told him that. So at that point, he grew irritated. He said, I think that you ought to try to look at Zach Adams. And he says, Zach Adams has a brother. If you want to get anywhere with this case, what you need to do is talk to Zach Adams' brother. Because Zach Adams has a brother named Dylan Adams. And I want to be politically correct here. I want to say things, I don't want to be offensive, but Dylan Adams has a low IQ. He has low intelligence. All through elementary school and high school, he was in special education classes. He was, he has low intelligence, and he also has some problems processing information. He's not very smart. And so Victor Dinsmore even says to Dennis Benjamin, it's the brother, it's not very smart. And, he's a slow brother, and if you want to get anywhere with this, you need to go talk to him. So, at some point, and the case is complicated. Again, like I said, there's a lot of people involved, a lot of information. But at some point, it turns out that Hansel McAdams, and this is before the election, Hansel McAdams has a woman, an assistant district attorney that works for him. Her name is Beth Hall. And Beth Hall works as a part-time state prosecutor for the district attorney's office. And she works part-time as a federal prosecutor, and she works for the federal United States Attorney's Office, prosecuting federal crimes. So Dylan Adams is then charged in a series of federal crimes, federal drug crimes. Dylan has not been convicted of a felony, and however, he's arrested along with a friend of his. The friend is a felon, and he's arrested in possession of some weapons. And so Dylan is arrested then on some very serious gun charges relating to the fact that his friend is a felon and is in possession of a weapon, and Dylan may or may not have supplied weapons. I think they're arrested for burglary of the friend's mother's house. They broke into the mother's house and took some guns from her. And so they're arrested on these charges. The prosecutor in this case is Beth Hall, who's also the assistant prosecutor and working on the disappearance of Holly Bobo. So she there. So she charges Dylan through the United States Attorney's Office on some federal gun charges. And Dylan is in federal custody in trial on those charges. And the most amazing thing happens. Dylan, who is facing 120 months, and that's federal talk, it's a 10-year sentence, but he's facing 120 months. And this is a crime, the crimes he is facing are crimes that you cannot get probation for. Probation is not allowed on those crimes. If you are convicted of those crimes, those are going to be sentences to serve in federal prison. And federal prison does not have a parole system. And so the most amazing thing happens. Dylan Adams has a guilty plea. He pleads guilty to these federal charges. He pleads to lesser charges. They modify the charges. He is released with no jail prison sentence to serve at all. He's released on a supervised release. But one of the conditions of his release is that he must go live with Dennis Benjamin. This is a condition that is agreed to by Beth Hall, the United States Attorney. At the time, Dylan Adams had a federal attorney who he had switched. Different people within the Federal Defender's Services were representing him, but he had an attorney who had agreed to this, and Jeff Jackson, who's one of the prosecutors in this case, Brent Booth and who's the TBI investigators, two of the lead TBI investigators in this case, Jeff Jackson and Brent Booth. both are very aware of the fact that Dylan Adams is now going to go live with Dennis Benjamin, a friend of the Bobo family who has been investigating the disappearance of Holly. And at this time, they've already had a series of interviews with Dylan Adams. And most of those, they've had a series of interrogations, with Dylan Adams. Most of those interrogations have been where Dylan had no attorney present. So they've taken this man who has low IQ. They've had multiple, perhaps even as many as 15 interrogations with the police. They've used the information that Dylan's been giving them, or the information that they've gotten through interrogations, to go ahead and get an indictment started on Zach Adams, and that's in the spring of 2014. They've gotten a basic indictment for homicide. This is before they found Holly's remains. They've gotten an indictment for homicide. Dylan is then released in August of 2014 to go live with Dennis Benjamin, a man that Dylan Adams does not know. He's not related to Dylan Adams. He's not a friend of Dylan Adams. He is released to go live with Dennis Benjamin. So Dylan goes to live with Dennis, and 5 weeks later, after having lived with Dennis Benjamin, Dennis calls the 911 system and announces over the 911 to the 911 operator, I have somebody at my house who's here wanting to confess to the murder of Holly Bobo, and what happened to Holly Bobo. So they bring Dylan in for additional questioning. This time they videotape it. They videotape what's said, and based on what Dylan says at this during this interrogation, they then get their indictment. This is when they get their next indictment, an indictment for the rape, the murder, and the kidnapping of Holly Bobo. And it's after this final session with Dylan Adams that they go ahead and they file their notice of death penalty. So now they have several people charged. They have charged Jason Autry. They go ahead and charge Dylan Adams with rape, murder, and kidnapping of Holly Bobo, and they charge Zach Adams with this. So now they have their indictments and they file their notice of death penalty. Well, turns out that there's some really big problems with this. One of the really big problems is that when they were getting Dylan Adams to do all this confessing, a lot of what he's confessed to doesn't match the physical evidence. After all, when they first start talking to Dylan Adams, they haven't done any searches on the Zach Adams property. Really, Zach Adams has a house that he inherited when his father died. It's right next door to his grandfather's house, and he owns it in part with his brother Dylan. But Dylan lives with the grandfather because Dylan's really not up to living on his own. So he lives, but they all live at the end of the same driveway in a very close to each other. And so after Dylan begins to talk to them first, while he's still in federal jail awaiting federal charges, they go ahead and they get extensive search warrants to search that property. And a lot of it was even broadcast on TV. They had helicopters out there. And you'll hear testimony in this trial about all of the searches they did. They went through Zach Adams' house and they took over 500 items out of that house. They took all the material off of all the mattresses. They took giant chunks of carpeting out of that house. They took whole pieces of furniture, upholstered chairs, leather couches, all kinds of ottomans and pillows and blankets and shelving. They went in to Zach Adams' house, and in the living room, they cut a hole in the floor that's as big as a car. And they took that floor down to the joists. I mean, you can see dirt. So they took the flooring out. They took the vinyl flooring that was under the wood floor. They took the subflooring out, and they left a hole to the dirt in that house. They took over 500 objects. They brought in backhoes. They searched through Dick Adams's house. They searched some property across the street. They seized, I think they seized 3 cars from the Adams family. 4 cars. They seized 4 cars from the Adams family and went through all the cars. Through everything. They also got all kinds of telephone records from them. They had terabytes of discovery in this case to provide, just of all the information that they had. Well, turns out the state has a terrible problem in this case. And their terrible problem is that the story that Dylan Adams has told does not match the physical evidence in the case. Because after they finished going through that whole house, there's no DNA that matches Holly to the house. There are no fingerprints that match Holly to the house or to the cars. There's no hair from Holly that matches Holly to Mr. Adams' house. And the cell phone records don't jive with what it is that Dylan Adams says that day. So now the state, by now there's been an election. Hansel McAdams is out. Matt Stowe has been elected. And then at some point, Matt Stowe has declined or recused himself, and the Memphis District Attorney's Office has been brought in. You know, the Memphis District Attorney's Office didn't start this case, but they've been brought in to finish the case. And so at this point then, the state has a problem. And the problem is they have a story from a man with his special education from school. The story doesn't jive with the evidence, and they are going to have real problems going forward with this case. The state needs something. And it is at this point, that they then decide they are going to buy and pay for testimony from somebody. They need to have somebody else to come in and testify. And what do? They buy. So Jason Autry basically sells his death penalty. He sells his death penalty to the state of Tennessee in the hopes that he will be released in a few months from now, by Christmas. That's his hope. He's going to get released, and he no longer has a death sentence on him because he has now come forward and he has a story. He has a story that's different than Dylan's story, but he has come forward with his own story. Jason Autry has had, presumably, he's had access to the discovery in this case for several years because he doesn't come forward with his story until January 20th, around January 20th of this year. And remember, this case started back in March of 2014 was when Zach Adams was initially indicted. But Jason Autry now comes forward with his story. And his story, like I said, is different than Dylan's story, but his story does kind of, you might liken it to somebody who's already had a floor plan of a building. Let's say it's an office building. They want to break into the office building. They have the floor plan. They know where all the cameras are, so they're able to kind of walk through the rooms of a building, a museum maybe. If you know where all the detectors are going to be, you kind of walk around it. That's kind of what Jason Autry's quote confession is, because Jason Autry's confession basically skirts around all the known evidence and the facts that can't be changed. It embraces some of the facts that are accurate and true, and then basically he says, yes, I was there for the killing part, the part that is death penalty eligible. Yes, I happened to be there. I happened to see the killing part. I can't explain to you the mysteries early in the morning of how Holly's kidnapped. I can't really, I wasn't there for that, so I really can't explain the real mystery that everybody once solved is, who kidnapped her, how did she get taken, where was she taken right after she was kidnapped, how did that happen? It's like I can't really solve all those problems for you, but what I can do is I can be your witness for the murder. So that's what he does. He comes in. But there's real problems with his story because, again, the cell phone records in this case, which in a way the state wants you to believe, well, the cell phone records are accurate because the cell phone records show that Jason and Autry and Zach Adams are together that morning for a period of time, and it's over somewhere towards the area of the Tennessee River. So Jason Autry says, yes, I was with him at the Tennessee River. But the problem is the cell phone records, which is in this case is the real evidence, the really strong evidence that they have about where the phones were that morning. The cell phone records do not jive with people having their cell phones and also being the ones that take Holly Bobo from her home, because none of the four participants, none of the four people that are accused of being involved in this crime, Dylan Adams, Jason Autry, Zach Adams, or Shane Austin, their phones are not in the same areas and travel together with Holly Bobo's phone. Holly Bobo's phone travels around that morning and they know where her phone was. So their phones are not with them. So the state wants you to, as they're going to tell you their evidence, well, yes, you need to rely on the cell phones when it matches what Jason says, that they're at the river that morning, but don't you worry about the cell phones when it shows that Holly's phone is moving independently of the other people's phones. And that's something you're going to want to look very closely at, is the cell phone evidence. But as we go through, you're going to want to listen very, very closely to what Jason Autry has to say. Because Jason Autry for years was innocent man walking. And then suddenly, January 20th, he has sold his death sentence to the state for what he hopes is going to be very little additional time to serve in jail. And that's going to be the true evidence in this case. As it shows, all the evidence will show that Zach Adams is not guilty of these 8 charges that he stands facing today.